The date is December 16th, 2025. And today, we have to confront a pretty unsettling reality, one that's testing the absolute limits of global stability. The conflict in Ukraine. It's not just a regional war anymore. It's become the crucible for global nuclear security.
Right now, as we're speaking, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is issuing these urgent, almost desperate warnings to the UN Security Council.
And it's about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the ZMPP.
Yes. He's stressing the absolute necessity of a security protection zone around it to stop a catastrophic accident from happening.
Because the integrity of the plant has been repeatedly violated.
Repeatedly, by direct military action. And this is, a terrifyingly concrete symptom of a much larger strategic failure. I mean, what happens when the world's most powerful deterrence systems start to fail? Not just diplomatically, but literally on the ground.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Subscribe to Defense Reports. It's your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports.
I'm Alex. Join me with Arya in the latest Deep Dive by Defense report for sharp, no-nonsense breakdowns of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic developments. And today we're going to cover how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is rewriting the rules of nuclear coercion, exposing global fault lines, and really reshaping the entire international security architecture.
This deep dive is for you, the learner, to navigate this high-stakes world of escalation control. We're going to analyze how Russia's overt nuclear rhetoric manipulates uncertainty, how the West has responded by incrementally crossing these red lines, and why the long-term impact on non-proliferation, especially in Asia, is far more dangerous than I think many people thought.
Okay, so let's unpack the core mechanism Russia is using here. Nuclear intimidation. We're not talking about, the immediate tactical use of a weapon.
Oh, not at all.
It's the constant, calculated drumbeat of threats, the kind designed to paralyze decision-making in Kyiv, in Washington, and in Brussels. So what's the historical context for this kind of strategic coercion?
Well, to really get how this works, you have to go back to the foundational theorist on this, Thomas Schelling. His classic idea defined nuclear deterrence, not as some kind of perfect force field, but as the threat that leaves something to chance.
The threat that leaves something to chance.
Exactly. The real deterrent isn't the certainty of massive retaliation. That was always terrifying. But the deep-seated fear of nuclear war itself. The fear that a conflict could just spiral completely out of control.
So it's not just a threat of what they intend to do, it's a threat of what might happen by accident. It's weaponizing the sheer unpredictability of it all.
That is the absolute essence of their strategy. The fear that a command chain breaks, a risk assessment fails, a miscalculation occurs. And we saw this right from the start of the full-scale invasion.
Putin's initial address.
Right. He threatened anyone who stood in Russia's way with consequences. His words were, such as you have never seen in your entire history.
A threat specifically designed to chill any Western intervention from the get-go.
Precisely. And the rhetoric has only gotten sharper since then. You look at Dmitry Medvedev's comments in 2024, where he explicitly warned about the possibility of an accidental, unintentional start of a nuclear conflict.
So he's framing this uncertainty as an unfortunate possibility, but it's really another layer of strategic intimidation.
It is. It forces Western leaders to constantly think about not just Russia's intention, but also the very real possibility of a loss of control. It really gets at the psychological dimension here.
Right, because the threats are credible precisely because they play on human emotions. Things like risk tolerance or the lack of emotional self-control among leaders under that kind of immense pressure.
It's a very dangerous game of brinkmanship. They are trying to manipulate that fear to get concessions or to stop deeper Western involvement.
So how does the West play this high-risk game without making things worse? I mean, you can't just meet it with silence.
No, and the U.S. response has involved these meticulously constructed countersignals. They're intentionally less overtly threatening than Moscow's, but they maintain this crucial strategic ambiguity.
Like President Biden's warnings.
Exactly. His warnings of consequential and catastrophic responses to any nuclear escalation.
And those warnings, delivered both privately and publicly, are a form of what's called intra-war deterrence, right? They don't explicitly promise a nuclear response, but they imply something severe, maybe a crippling conventional strike, while leaving that door open to further escalation.
That open door is the key. It's the uncertainty that keeps their own threat credible. And this kind of strategic signaling is so essential because, what kept the Cold War manageable, what kept it from going over the abyss, was a strict, unwritten code of conduct.
Okay, let's turn to those rules. What were those unspoken limits before Ukraine just shattered them?
Well, there's a major study by George on Cold War crisis management, and it identified a basic rule of prudence that governed the Soviet-U.S. rivalry. And the rule was simple.
What was it?
Neither superpower initiates military action directly against the forces of the other. Avoiding a direct armed clash, even a small one, was the absolute key to managing escalation.
And that is the norm that is just completely gone now. We're in an environment where the U.S. and Russia are essentially in an indirect military confrontation.
That's right. The conflict now involves improvising what you could call ad hoc ground rules for escalation control. And it's happening in real time. Both sides are constantly testing limits
How do they do that?
by restricting objectives, limiting the means they use, like the type or quantity of weapons-defining targets, participants, and very importantly, geographical boundaries.
And this testing of limits is fascinating because the West hasn't really stuck to its own initial self-imposed limits, which brings us to this idea of salami slicing.
That's the mechanism. Salami slicing is the gradual, gentle erosion of a boundary without ever doing something so dramatic that it forces a massive reprisal.
And the West's military aid to Ukraine has been exactly that.
It has. An incremental process of testing Russia's supposed red lines. And every time Moscow's reaction is just rhetorical, the constraints get relaxed a little more.
We've seen this play out so clearly. It started with small anti-tank weapons, then it moved to advanced artillery, and now we've seen the relaxing of restrictions on using long-range missiles against targets inside Russia.
Which raises a crucial point that analysts flagged. The U.S. policy seemed, overcautious early in the war. And that caution had, quote, serious repercussions for Ukraine, and hence for the security outcome for Western Europe.
But that's the core of the dilemma, isn't it? On one hand, caution seems prudent to avoid the worst-case scenario. On the other hand, it gives the initiative to the aggressor.
Exactly. But the fact that those constraints were relaxed successfully, the salami slicing back in the other direction, it shows that sustained political will, even under nuclear pressure, is critical. It proved those red lines were movable all along.
A prime example of this whole dynamic is the Kerch Strait Bridge, the Crimean Bridge.
Ukraine insists it's a key, legitimate military target. And it is. It's vital for Russian logistics.
And Russia immediately uses any attack on it to try and stoke Western nervousness.
They do. They use it as a focal point for intimidation. They even tried to intimidate Germany over the delivery of Taurus missiles, making these wild claims that striking German factories would be, quote, in full compliance with international law.
Which is a complete distortion, but it serves the purpose of making Western capitals hesitate. And this brings us from the abstract theory of risk right down to the tangible physical danger. Specifically at Zaporizhia, what is the status of the ZNPP, and why is it such a unique, immediate risk?
The ZNPP site, it's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, was taken by Russian forces way back in March 2022. Since then, the facility has repeatedly lost its external power supply.
Forcing it to rely on what? Backup generators?
Backup diesel generator, just for the essential cooling and safety processes. If those systems fail, we're talking about a major radiological disaster.
And the military activity around it has been constant, which makes failure a tragic possibility.
The reports are deeply disturbing. Drone strikes, as recently as April 2024, damaged buildings and equipment. Thankfully, not the critical safety systems themselves, but the IAEA experts confirmed the physical integrity of the plant has been violated multiple times.
So the risk of a severe nuclear accident is extremely high.
It is, prompting those ongoing urgent calls we mentioned at the start for a protection zone. It's a literal physical manifestation of deterrence failing. This facility is being treated like a conventional military object.
And yet, despite all this risk, we know Russia has kept the emergency hotlines open with the U.S. and NATO.
Right. Secure systems dating back to the Cold War. They're there to deflate crises. So they recognize the danger, but their actions on the ground just completely contradict any attempt at de-escalation.
That's the core tension. They keep the tools for de-escalation while simultaneously dismantling the decades-old legal architecture that was supposed to prevent this in the first place.
And that is the long-term, devastating strategic threat. Russia suspended its participation in the New START Treaty. It de-ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Foundational elements of global stability are just being swept aside.
But the most critical one for Ukraine is Russia completely violating its 1994 commitments under the Budapest Memorandum.
Yes, where they guaranteed respect for Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Kyiv giving up its nuclear weapons.
And that violation leads directly to the next global risk. the proliferation domino effect.
It does. Ukraine's experience giving up nuclear weapons only to be invaded is sending a devastatingly clear message to every other vulnerable state out there.
The message being, if you're threatened by a great power, the only real guarantee of your survival is a nuclear deterrent.
Precisely. This is a huge concern, and it's concentrating heavily in Asia, particularly in Japan and South Korea. Concerns there about American resolve, about the reliability of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, have intensified dramatically.
And we've seen prominent political figures there openly arguing for a change.
We have. They're talking about bolstering extended deterrence, maybe through nuclear sharing arrangements like NATO, or even developing their own indigenous capabilities. The choice the U.S. makes here will be the single most important factor for future proliferation in that whole region.
The invasion has also just dramatically reconfigured geopolitics, far beyond military alliances. I mean, while the West has largely aligned in condemning the invasion, the global response is profoundly fractured.
And that fracturing isn't a simple North versus South issue, which is the frame we often see. We need a better framework, like John Alkenberry's Three Worlds idea: the global West, the rival East led by China, and the often non-aligned global South.
And within that third group, we're seeing a distinct democratic divide. Explain that. Why aren't major democracies aligning with the West here?
That's the paradox. The world's largest global South democracies, India, Brazil, Indonesia, have diverged significantly from the West. They're challenging the frame of this war as a simple democracy versus autocracy struggle.
Because their position is driven by pragmatic national interests.
Intensely pragmatic interests. Take India. They adopted what's been called studied public neutrality. They've abstained on crucial UN votes. And most importantly, India has benefited massively from cheap Russian oil, which surged to over 40% of its crude imports by 2024.
So this isn't about challenging the rule of law. It's about their own deep-seated strategic concerns about China and Pakistan and their historic military ties to Russia.
Exactly. Their security needs trump ideological alignment. And Brazil followed a similar path. They voted to condemn the invasion at the UN, but explicitly refused to implement sanctions. President Lula positioned Brazil as a non-aligned peacemaker.
To protect crucial economic links with China and Russia.
Right, and this pragmatic pursuit of national interest is just accelerating these broader global trends we were already seeing, like deglobalization and economic bifurcation.
Technology sanctions and export controls are front and center now.
Absolutely. And this creates a fascinating strategic fallout. Countries that aren't directly involved are watching the West use its economic power, and they are adapting their own economies to counter the risk of future Western economic coercion. This makes the future use of sanctions much more complicated.
This has been a crucial analysis. We've covered the theoretical tightrope walk of escalation control, the concrete threat at Zaporizhia, the long-term damage to non-proliferation, and the surprising democratic divergence in the global South.
And if we step back, I think the foundational threat to international security is clear. It's the risk that aggressive war becomes, once again, a viable path for political gain. Therefore, the strategic priority, the absolute priority, has to be preserving the prohibition on territorial conquest.
So any push for peace has to prioritize that legal foundation of sovereignty over, say, diplomatic speed or convenience.
It has to. Any agreement that compromises Ukraine's territorial integrity, even for short-term peace, risks fatally diluting this foundational norm. And that norm is what has kept great power war off the table for decades. When you look at the whole strategic picture, you have to ask yourself, what is the certainty of territorial integrity worth globally, given all the volatility we've just discussed? That's the question that has to define this future.
You've been listening to Defense Report by Alex and Aria, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry.
And don't forget to subscribe to Defense Reports. It's your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.